Savannah Reed was 19 years old when she bought the rusted houseboat for $5 and a promise that nobody would come looking for it again. Rain hammered the bayou that night hard enough to blur the trees into dark smears against the water. The dock creaked beneath her boots as she dragged a single suitcase through puddles that smelled of mud, gasoline, and swamp rot. Mosquitoes circled the weak yellow lantern hanging outside the marina office, and somewhere deeper in the reeds, a gator slid quietly into black water. The old man at the dock kept shaking his head. "That boat should have sunk 20 years ago," he muttered. "People around here stopped going near it for a reason." Savannah looked past him toward the houseboat tied at the far end of the dock. Rust climbed the sides like dried blood. One window was broken. Part of the roof sagged inward. The name painted near the stern had almost disappeared beneath mildew and river stains. Still, it floated. Barely. Behind her sat the only suitcase she owned. Ahead of her drifted the only thing in the world she could afford. But what nobody in the bayou knew was that beneath the warped floorboards, sealed behind a compartment someone had fought hard to hide, rested evidence powerful enough to shake families that had controlled the parish for generations. And before the summer ended, that dying houseboat would give Savannah Reed back a name the world had already buried. Savannah grew up in a narrow white church standing beside a muddy Louisiana road where the grass never seemed fully dry and the air always smelled faintly of rainwater and old wood. Her father preached there every Sunday beneath slow-turning ceiling fans that clicked like tired clocks. People in the parish respected Pastor Reed because his voice carried certainty. He spoke about obedience, discipline, and sin with the calm confidence of a man who believed softness led people toward ruin. By the time Savannah turned 8, she already understood that crying in public embarrassed him. Her mother died the following spring after a fever moved through the parish during flood season. Savannah still remembered standing outside the bedroom door while women from the church carried wet towels and bowls of water past her into the dark room. No one explained much. Children in the bayou learned early that grief often arrived quietly and stayed without permission. After the funeral, the house grew colder in ways that had nothing to do with weather. Her father became stricter. Silence became a kind of rule inside the home. Meals were eaten with little conversation. Mistakes were corrected immediately. Questions were treated carefully, like sparks near gasoline. So Savannah learned to keep pieces of herself hidden. At night, she drew boats in a small notebook she kept beneath her mattress. Shrimp boats, tugboats, old ferries she saw near the marsh channels. Sometimes she copied river maps from worn library books at school. Sometimes she imagined places far beyond the parish where nobody knew her father's name. The only person who ever noticed those drawings was her grandfather. And unlike everyone else in the family, he never told her to stop. Savannah's grandfather lived alone in a weathered cypress cabin several miles beyond the church roads, where the bayou widened into slow-moving channels lined with reeds and leaning willow trees. People in town described him as stubborn, quiet, and difficult to know. Savannah only knew he smelled like engine oil, river water, and pipe tobacco. When she was 10, he began taking her onto the water with him before sunrise. His fishing boat was old and uneven, patched in different places with mismatched metal plates, but he trusted it more than most people. Savannah loved the sound of the small diesel engine rattling awake in the fog. She loved the way the lantern light bounced against black water while insects hummed in the reeds around them. Her grandfather taught her things nobody else considered important for a girl to know. How to listen for problems inside an engine before they became visible. How to tell when water beneath a boat was too shallow by the color alone. How to follow old river markers nearly swallowed by vines and mud. How to stay calm when something broke far from shore. Most people panic before they think, he once told her while tightening a fuel line with grease, darkened hands. Water punishes people who panic. Before she turned 13, he gave her an old brass compass scratched along the edges from years in his pocket. The glass was slightly cracked, but the needle still held steady. "Things disappear out here," he said quietly. "Roads, boats, sometimes people. Best learn how to find your way back." Savannah carried the compass everywhere after that. Her father hated it. He called the bayou dangerous, aimless, and full of men who wasted their lives drifting nowhere. But Savannah noticed something strange whenever her father spoke about the waterways. He sounded afraid of them. The marriage arrangement was announced 3 weeks after Savannah turned 19. Her father presented it the way he presented scripture, calmly, as though the decision had already existed long before anyone in the room became aware of it. The man waiting for her after Sunday service was nearly twice her age, the owner of a fuel supply company connected to several wealthy families near the southern marshes. He spoke politely, smiled often, never once asked Savannah what she wanted. Everyone else acted as though her future had just been saved. Women from the church touched her shoulder and told her she was fortunate. Men shook her father's hand outside beneath the oak trees while humidity gathered on their collars. Even the girls she grew up beside avoided meeting her eyes afterward, as though silence itself had become contagious. Savannah refused 2 nights later at the dinner table. The room went completely still. Her father did not yell immediately. Somehow that felt worse. He simply folded his hands beside his untouched plate and stared at her with the cold expression he usually reserved for funerals. After that evening, the house no longer felt like home. Doors closed when she entered rooms. Conversation stopped around her. At church, people shifted away in pews that once felt familiar. By the end of the week, even the small bait shop where she worked quietly informed her they no longer needed extra help. And the thing that finally shattered what remained of her old life did not arrive with shouting or violence. It arrived quietly, just before dawn, with a suitcase beside the front porch door. Savannah stood on the porch for nearly a full minute before she touched the suitcase. The air outside carried the heavy dampness that settled over the bayou before sunrise. Somewhere far beyond the trees, frogs croaked in uneven rhythm, and water dripped steadily from the roof after the night's rain. The porch boards beneath her bare feet felt swollen from humidity. She already knew the suitcase was hers. The faded blue fabric, the broken zipper pull tied together with string, the small tear near the side pocket where the stitching had split years earlier. Her father had packed it carefully. That somehow hurt more than anger would have. The front door remained closed behind her. No light appeared inside the house. No footsteps crossed the hallway floorboards. Savannah waited anyway, staring at the dark window above the sink, half expecting someone to change their mind. Nobody did. By sunrise, she carried the suitcase down the muddy road leading away from the church. She did not cry while leaving. She waited until the church steeple disappeared behind cypress trees before the tears finally came. Even then, she covered her mouth to keep the sound small. The parish moved quickly once people realized Pastor Reed's daughter had been turned out. In a town where nearly everyone attended the same church, news spread faster than river currents after heavy rain. At first, people pretended kindness. An older woman from the congregation offered Savannah leftover biscuits wrapped in cloth but avoided inviting her inside. Another family allowed her to sleep one night in a tool shed behind their house before explaining awkwardly the next morning that they did not want trouble with her father. By the third day, the pity began changing shape. People stopped speaking directly to her in stores. Conversations lowered when she entered rooms. Mothers quietly pulled younger daughters closer while passing her on sidewalks. Savannah realized the parish had already decided what kind of woman she must be if even Pastor Reed no longer wanted her beneath his roof. The humiliation settled into her slowly, like swamp water leaking through cracked boards. She spent afternoons sitting beside the bus station near the highway with her suitcase beside her feet, pretending she waited for transportation she could not afford. Sometimes she read old newspapers left behind on benches. Sometimes she watched tourists pass through on their way toward better-known parts of Louisiana, people who saw the bayou as scenery instead of something that could trap a life inside it. At night, she slept wherever she could. One evening beneath the covered storage area behind the bait shop, another inside a church supply shed that smelled like bleach and damp cardboard. Twice beneath the marina awning while mosquitoes fed along her arms and neck until sunrise. The marina owner found her there on the second morning. His name was Leroy Thibodeau, though most people simply called him Lee. He was tall, thin, and permanently sunburned from decades spent working along the water. One of his knees dragged slightly when he walked. He studied Savannah for several seconds before speaking. "You Pastor Reed's girl?" Savannah nodded cautiously. Lee spit tobacco juice into the water beside the dock. "Heard about that." She waited for judgment to follow. It usually did. Instead, he pointed toward the marina office. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." The gesture nearly broke her apart. Inside, the office smelled like old paper, diesel fuel, and stale cigarette smoke. A small fan rattled beside the window while Lee poured black coffee into a chipped mug without asking how she liked it. "You planning on leaving town?" he asked eventually. "I don't know. That usually means no." Savannah lowered her eyes toward the coffee. For several moments, only the ticking wall clock filled the room. Then Lee spoke again. "There's an old boat tied past the south dock." He scratched his jaw thoughtfully. "Been sitting there near 20 years now." Savannah looked up. "I don't have money for a boat. You got $5? She blinked. "That thing ain't worth more than scrap metal." He shrugged. "Technically belonged to a man who disappeared. Taxes stopped getting paid. Nobody claimed it." Savannah stared through the office window toward the distant line of docks disappearing into fog. "Why hasn't anyone taken it?" Lee gave a dry laugh. "People around here got stories." "What kind of stories?" "The kind folks tell when they don't want to admit fear." He leaned back in his chair. boat belonged to the Delacroix family once. Husband and wife vanished sometime in the 80s. Couple years later, another man tried fixing the place up. Left after 3 nights. He paused, said he heard noises below deck. Savannah almost smiled despite herself. You believe that? No. Lee lifted one shoulder casually. But I believe people can scare themselves into seeing ghosts where guilt ought to be. That sentence stayed with her. Guilt. Not ghosts. Outside, wind pushed slow ripples through the dark bayou water. Somewhere farther down the dock, loose metal clanged softly against a mast. Savannah wrapped both hands around the warm mug. For the first time since leaving home, she felt something dangerous begin forming beneath her exhaustion. Not hope exactly. Something smaller. A possibility. And later that afternoon, when Lee finally walked her down the rotting southern dock toward the rusted houseboat half hidden beneath hanging moss and years of neglect, Savannah felt a strange tightening in her chest. The boat looked wounded, but so did she. And somehow, in the fading Louisiana light, neither of them seemed fully dead yet. The houseboat sat at the farthest edge of the marina where the dockboards sagged low over dark water and most of the working fishermen no longer bothered tying up their boats. Savannah followed Lee carefully along the narrow planks while humid wind moved through the cypress trees overhead. Moss hung from branches like gray fabric left out in the rain too long. Somewhere nearby, insects screamed in the reeds with the steady metallic rhythm of summer in southern Louisiana. The closer they got to the boat, the worse it looked. Rust consumed nearly every exposed piece of metal. One side leaned slightly lower into the water than the other. The windows were clouded with grime and cracked along the corners. Mold spread beneath the roofline in black streaks. The faded name painted across the stern barely remained visible. Maribelle. Savannah stopped several feet away. She still floats? She asked quietly. Most days. That's not comforting. Lee laughed under his breath. Told you. Ain't much of a sales pitch. The front deck groaned when he stepped aboard. Savannah followed more slowly, gripping the railing as the boat shifted beneath her weight. The smell hit immediately. Stagnant water, mildew, rust, and old wood swollen from decades of humidity. Inside, the cabin looked abandoned by more than time alone. A small table remained bolted near one wall beneath a crooked window. Dust covered everything thick enough to leave finger marks. Part of the ceiling had collapsed near the rear hallway, leaving warped boards exposed above hanging insulation. Empty shelves leaned sideways. A coffee mug still sat near the sink, as though someone had once planned to return after only a few minutes away. But nobody had. Not for years. Savannah moved slowly through the narrow cabin while Lee waited near the doorway. The silence inside the boat felt strange. Not peaceful. Held. Like a breath that had never fully released. She crouched near the small iron stove built into the wall. Rust covered the outer surface, but the pipe itself still looked intact. Beside it sat an overturned metal toolbox partially hidden beneath fallen cloth. Mind if I open this? Lee shrugged. Boat's yours if you want it. The hinges screamed softly when Savannah lifted the lid. Inside rested old wrenches, screwdrivers, fishing line, spare bolts, and a flashlight wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Rust touched some of the tools, but others remained surprisingly clean. Someone had protected them. Savannah ran her fingers lightly across the flashlight. Small hope. The phrase appeared in her mind without warning. Not enough to fix her life. Not enough to erase what happened, but enough to survive another night. Lee watched her quietly for a while before speaking again. You really thinking about doing this? Savannah looked around the ruined cabin. Outside the cracked windows, bayou water shifted darkly beneath gathering evening clouds. The place was ugly. Damp. Falling apart. But nobody could throw her out of it. That mattered more than comfort. How much did you say? $5. She reached into her coat pocket slowly and removed the folded bills she had left. $7 and some loose coins. Almost everything she still owned in the world. For several seconds, she stared at the money in her hand. The amount looked too small to begin a future with. Too small to buy dignity. Too small to rebuild a life. But she thought about the church pews turning cold around her. The silence at the dinner table. The way her father never once stepped onto the porch while she left. She thought about sleeping beside bus station benches while strangers stared through her like something already ruined. Then she looked back at the houseboat. Broken, recognized, broken. I'll take it, she said. Lee studied her face carefully, perhaps waiting for fear to appear there at the last second. Instead, Savannah handed him the money. The old marina owner accepted it slowly. Well, he muttered, guess the Maribel finally found somebody stubborn enough. Rain began falling again as evening settled over the bayou. Lee helped her carry the suitcase aboard along with 2 blankets, a dented lantern, and a plastic container filled with canned food left over from the marina office. You'll want to keep lights low after midnight, he warned while setting the lantern on the table. Why? Generators attract bugs. He paused. And attention. Savannah looked toward him sharply. You expecting somebody to come out here? No, but he answered too slowly. Just saying folks around these waters notice changes. Thunder rolled somewhere far beyond the marshes. Lee reached into his coat pocket before leaving and placed a small key onto the table. What's this? Fuel compartment. He glanced around the cabin. Old auxiliary tanks still got a little diesel left if the lines ain't clogged. Savannah wrapped her fingers around the key. Why are you helping me? The older man stood silently for several moments. Finally, he sighed. Because 30 years ago, somebody should have helped my sister when folks around here decided her life didn't matter anymore. Before Savannah could answer, he stepped back toward the doorway. Lock the rear hatch before dark, he said. And if you hear boats moving after midnight, don't go outside to look. Then he disappeared into the rain. Savannah stood alone inside the houseboat, while water tapped softly against the hull below her feet. For a long time, she listened to the sounds around her. Rain on metal. Wind against loose boards, water beneath the floor. The boat shifted gently in the current, almost like breathing. Finally, Savannah set her suitcase beside the narrow bunk near the wall and lit the lantern. Weak amber light spread through the ruined cabin, touching rust, dust, and peeling paint. It was terrible. It was damp. It smelled like old storms and forgotten years. But when she locked the cabin door for the first time, something loosened painfully inside her chest. Nobody else had given her a place to stay. Nobody else had wanted her. Yet somehow, at the edge of the bayou, inside a sinking houseboat everyone feared, Savannah Reed finally possessed one thing nobody could take away with a church vote or a family name. A door that closed behind her because she chose it to. Savannah spent her first 2 nights aboard the Maribel tied to the marina dock because she was too afraid to move it. The fear embarrassed her. Not because the boat looked difficult to handle, though it certainly did, but because the water itself seemed alive after dark. Sounds traveled strangely across the bayou at night. Frogs croaked in uneven bursts from unseen reeds. Fish broke the surface without warning. Tree branches scraped against one another like whispers moving through the fog. And sometimes, long after midnight, distant boat engines echoed somewhere far out beyond the marsh channels. Each time Savannah heard them, she remembered Lee's warning and kept the lantern turned low. By the 3rd morning, however, she understood something important. The marina was temporary. If she stayed tied there too long, people would begin asking questions. Fishermen already stared when they passed the southern dock. 2 teenage boys had thrown beer bottles toward the boat the previous evening while laughing about ghost girls living with dead people. The Maribel might belong to Savannah now, but the marina never would. So just after sunrise, with fog still floating low over the black water, she unlocked the fuel compartment using Lee's small brass key. The hatch resisted at first, before finally jerking open with a shriek of rusted metal. Inside sat an old diesel tank coated in grime and spiderwebs. Savannah crouched beside it carefully. Her grandfather's lessons returned slowly through memory, checking fuel lines, inspecting corrosion, listening instead of rushing. She worked methodically, wiping dirt from connectors and tightening loose fittings with tools from the metal box she found near the stove. Grease darkened her fingers. Humidity soaked through the back of her shirt before the sun fully climbed above the trees. Twice, she nearly gave up. Then, after several failed attempts, the engine coughed violently beneath the deck. Savannah froze. Another cough followed. Then a deep rattling roar spread through the hull, uneven but alive. She laughed out loud before she could stop herself. It was the first genuine sound of happiness that had left her body in weeks. The Maribel shuddered hard enough to rattle dishes somewhere inside the cabin, but the engine continued running. Barely. Savannah untied the dock ropes with nervous hands. The boat drifted outward slowly into the channel. For one terrifying second, panic climbed into her throat. The current felt stronger away from the dock. Water moved beneath the hull in strange directions, pulling at the boat like unseen hands. But then she remembered her grandfather's voice. Most people panic before they think, so she forced herself to breathe slowly. The steering wheel resisted when she turned it, stiff from years without movement, but gradually the old houseboat responded. The marina disappeared behind morning fog as Savannah guided the Maribel deeper into the bayou. The farther she traveled, the quieter the world became. Road sounds vanished first, then the distant hum of traffic, then even the occasional noise from fishermen. Soon only insects, water, and engine vibrations remained. The bayou unfolded around her in endless shades of green and black. Cypress knees rose from the water like drowned gravestones. Moss hung low enough to brush the roof of the houseboat in narrow passages. White birds lifted suddenly from the reeds as the Maribel drifted past. The heat thickened steadily through the morning. By noon, sweat covered Savannah's neck and arms. Humidity pressed against her skin like wet cloth. Even breathing felt heavier out there, away from open roads and moving air. She checked the old compass repeatedly while following faded channel markers barely visible among vines and overgrowth. Several times she wondered if she had gone too far. Then she found it. The dock. Or what remained of it. Weathered wooden posts leaned sideways from dark water beside a narrow patch of raised ground hidden among cypress trees. Most of the old planks had collapsed years earlier, leaving only a partial walkway connected to a rusted mooring pole. Savannah cut the engine carefully. The sudden silence rang in her ears. No nearby houses. No road. No church bells. Nothing except wind moving through swamp grass and insects singing somewhere deep in the marsh. The isolation should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, exhaustion settled over her almost peacefully. She tied the Maribel beside the broken dock and stepped onto land carefully for the first time. Mud swallowed part of her boot immediately. Perfect, she muttered under her breath. A narrow trail disappeared into thick trees nearby, almost entirely reclaimed by vegetation. Judging by the condition of the path, nobody had walked there regularly in years. Savannah turned slowly back toward the houseboat. In daylight, away from the marina, the Maribel looked even more damaged. Rust streaked downward along the hull. Part of the rear railing sagged loose. Torn curtains shifted behind cracked windows. One side of the roof dipped lower than the other. It looked abandoned by the world. Left behind. Forgotten deliberately. Yet the boat floated steadily beside the dock as sunlight reflected across the dark water beneath it. Savannah stood quietly for several moments, listening to the creak of old wood and the soft knock of the hull against the posts. This was not the kind of place people came to build new lives. It was the kind of place people disappeared into. And somewhere deep beneath her fear, Savannah realized that was exactly why she had chosen it. Nobody came looking for forgotten things in the bayou, which meant whatever secrets the Maribel carried had likely remained untouched for a very long time. The first storm hit just before nightfall. Savannah noticed the sky changing while hauling supplies from one side of the boat to the other. The air grew strangely still, heavy in the way Louisiana weather sometimes became before violent rain. Even the insects quieted. Then thunder rolled somewhere beyond the trees. By the time darkness settled across the bayou, wind had already begun pushing water hard enough against the hull to rock the Maribel unevenly beside the dock. Savannah lit the lantern and moved quickly through the cabin, checking windows. The front left corner leaked immediately. Rainwater slipped through cracks near the roof and dripped steadily onto the warped floorboards. She shoved a cooking pot beneath the leak before moving toward the rear hallway, where loose boards rattled loudly every time the wind struck the boat sideways. The entire structure groaned around her. Not metaphorically, actually groaned. Wood shifted somewhere inside the walls with low aching sounds like tired bones beneath too much weight. Rusted metal bolts clicked softly beneath the floor. Water slapped against the hull in uneven bursts. For several terrifying minutes, Savannah became certain the houseboat might split apart before morning. But the Maribel held. Not comfortably, not gracefully. Still, it held. Hours later, after the worst of the storm passed, Savannah sat wrapped in a blanket beside the small iron stove trying to dry her socks near weak heat from the fire she finally managed to build. The cabin smelled like smoke, mildew, and wet wood. Rain continued dripping steadily into the cooking pot. Blink, blink, blink. Savannah stared at the lantern flame while exhaustion pulled heavily at her shoulders. This was the moment she should have regretted everything. Instead, she felt something stranger. Relief. Nobody could tell her to leave. Nobody could shame her inside these walls. Nobody here cared whether she disappointed a church congregation or embarrassed her father. The boat was broken, but its brokenness belonged to her. The next morning, survival became work. Real work. Not imagining, not hoping, not waiting for rescue. Savannah rose at sunrise and began cleaning. The cabin looked worse in daylight than it had the night before. Mold spread behind cabinets in dark stains. Dead insects filled corners beneath shelves. Part of the rear floor felt soft beneath her boots from long-term water damage. She opened every cracked window she could manage despite the humidity and started carrying ruined objects outside one piece at a time. Broken dishes, waterlogged blankets, rotting newspapers fused together by moisture, a chair missing one leg, 3 trash bags full of things too damaged to save. By mid-morning, sweat soaked completely through her clothes. Mosquitoes swarmed constantly around her neck and wrists. Mud coated the bottom of her boots from repeated trips across the collapsing dock. Still, she kept working, because movement kept fear away. At some point during the afternoon, Savannah discovered the old hand pump near the sink still functioned. Barely. Brown water coughed from the pipe at first, followed by cleaner flow after several attempts. She laughed quietly to herself. Water. Another small hope. Later she found canned beans sealed inside a rusted cabinet untouched by insects. Then dry firewood stacked carefully beneath a tarp near the rear deck. Someone long ago had prepared this boat for survival in ways that did not match the abandonment surrounding it. That realization unsettled her more than the storm had. People did not organize firewood neatly before vanishing forever. Near sunset, she climbed onto the roof carrying a hammer and several bent nails salvaged from the toolbox. Wind moved softly through the cypress trees, while orange light spread across the water beyond the reeds. From up there, the bayou seemed endless. No church steeple, no roads, no reminders of the life that rejected her. Only water channels twisting through swamp grass beneath slow-moving fog. Savannah repaired what she could before darkness returned. A loose metal panel, part of the roof edge, one broken shutter hanging near the kitchen window. Small repairs. Temporary repairs. But repairs nonetheless. As she worked, she noticed something strange about the boat itself. Despite obvious neglect, certain parts remained unusually maintained. The engine compartment had been protected carefully against moisture. The stovepipe showed less rust than surrounding metal. Several floor bolts near the center cabin looked newer than the others. And near the rear hallway, she found scrape marks along the floorboards that seemed too deliberate to be random damage. Savannah crouched beside them silently, long parallel scratches. Heavy. Repeated. As though something large had been dragged across the floor many times. She touched the marks lightly with her fingertips. The wood there felt smoother than surrounding boards. Whirn. Her stomach tightened slightly. Then a distant engine sound drifted faintly through the trees. Savannah stood immediately. The noise disappeared almost as quickly as it came, swallowed by swamp distance and evening insects. Still, she remained motionless for several seconds, listening carefully. Nothing. Only wind. Only water. Eventually, she climbed back down into the cabin and locked the door. That night, she ate canned beans beside the stove while rainwater simmered in an old kettle for cleaning. The lantern cast weak amber light across peeling walls and rusted fixtures. Outside, frogs croaked somewhere close to shore. The boat shifted gently beneath her feet. Savannah pulled the brass compass from her coat pocket and turned it slowly in her hands. The cracked glass reflected lantern light in thin gold lines. Her grandfather used to say old boats carried memory inside them. Not ghosts. Not curses. Memory. Every repair. Every storm. Every hand that built something inside the walls. Every fear, every attempt to survive. Savannah looked around the ruined cabin carefully. The Maribel did not feel empty. It felt interrupted, as though whoever left never intended the story to end this way. Much later, after extinguishing the lantern, Savannah lay awake listening to the sounds around her. Water beneath the hull, branches brushing the roof, wind through distant reeds. Then another sound, soft, metal against wood. Clunk. Savannah opened her eyes immediately. The noise came again somewhere below the cabin floor. Not loud. Not accidental either. Clunk. She sat upright slowly in darkness, heart beginning to pound. For several long seconds, she listened without moving. Nothing followed. Eventually the bayou sounds returned to normal around her. Still, sleep did not come easily afterward. Because somewhere beneath the rotting floorboards of the Maribel, hidden beneath years of rust and silence, something had moved. Savannah waited until morning before investigating the sound. Not because curiosity faded overnight, but because fear settled into something more manageable under daylight. The bayou looked less haunted after sunrise. Mist drifting above the water softened the broken edges of things. Even the Maribel appeared less threatening beneath pale morning light leaking through the trees. Still, the memory of the noise stayed with her. Clunk. Metal against wood. Deliberate enough that she could not convince herself it came from wind alone. She brewed weak coffee using rainwater boiled over the stove and forced herself to think carefully before acting. Panic solved nothing. Her grandfather repeated that lesson often enough she could still hear the rough shape of his voice whenever she became afraid. So Savannah started with observation. She walked slowly through the cabin, studying the floorboards more carefully than before. Near the stove, the wood remained uneven but solid. Toward the rear hallway, however, subtle differences began appearing once she stopped rushing. Certain bolts looked newer. Not new exactly, just newer than everything around them. The scratches she noticed the previous evening seemed clearer in daylight too. Long drag marks crossed part of the floor near the narrow table bolted beside the wall. Savannah crouched again. This time she pressed her palm flat against the boards. Cold. Damp. Then, she knocked lightly against the wood with her knuckles. Solid. She moved several inches left and tried again. Tonk. Different. Hollow. Her pulse quickened immediately. Savannah stayed perfectly still for several seconds listening to the silence around her. Outside, insects buzzed through reeds while water tapped softly against the hull. Nothing else moved. Slowly, she stood and retrieved a screwdriver from the toolbox. The first bolt resisted completely. The second turned halfway before locking. The third loosened. Savannah swallowed carefully. Someone had removed these before. Not recently, but intentionally. She worked another 20 minutes before sweat dampened her hairline and grease stained both hands. Finally, after loosening enough rusted fasteners, she managed to pry upward along the edge of the floor panel. The wood lifted barely half an inch before stopping hard against something underneath. Not another board. Metall. Savannah froze. For a long moment she simply stared downward through the narrow opening. Then she widened the gap slightly and angled the lantern lower. A steel surface reflected weak amber light beneath the floorboards. Not part of the boat's original structure. A compartment, sealed deliberately beneath the cabin floor. Savannah's heartbeat became painfully loud inside her chest. She lowered herself carefully onto one knee and brushed dirt away from the exposed metal edge. More scratches appeared there too, old scrape marks along the sides as though the compartment had once been opened repeatedly before being hidden again. Her hands trembled slightly now, not from fear alone, from the growing realization that somebody had worked very hard to conceal whatever rested beneath her feet, and somebody else had worked equally hard to keep it closed. Savannah searched the compartment edges for a latch but found only rusted seams and one partially concealed indentation near the lower corner. A keyhole. Very small. Very old. She sat back slowly. The cabin suddenly felt warmer than before. Outside, wind moved through the swamp grass with soft whispering sounds that seemed strangely close against the windows. Savannah looked instinctively toward the door. Still locked. Still alone. Yet, for the first time since arriving at the bayou, she experienced the uncomfortable sensation of standing inside another person's unfinished business. She reached automatically into her coat pocket for the brass compass. The cracked glass felt cool against her thumb. Think first. Her grandfather again. Always that. Think before panic. Savannah forced herself to stop touching the compartment and study the surrounding cabin instead. That was when she noticed the initials, small letters carved beneath the underside of the table near the wall. Yay. They. The marks were shallow and partially hidden by years of grime, but clearly intentional. Savannah frowned. De la Croix, the family Lee mentioned. She moved closer, cleaning more dirt away carefully. Below the initials rested another carving almost impossible to see unless light struck sideways across the wood. A shape. Not random. A map marker. One of the old river symbols her grandfather once taught her to recognize, used decades earlier by fishermen navigating hidden marsh channels before modern routes became common. Why would somebody carve navigation markings inside a houseboat cabin? Unless the boat traveled places people preferred not to document officially. Savannah's stomach tightened again. She stepped backward slowly and looked around the cabin with new eyes now. The protected tools, the maintained engine compartment, the replaced bolts, the hidden steel container. None of it matched an ordinary abandoned boat. The Maribel had not simply been forgotten. It had been left behind carefully. Suddenly another memory surfaced. Lee saying the first repairman stayed only 3 nights. Said he heard noises below deck. Savannah looked again toward the compartment beneath the floorboards. Maybe the man had heard something real. Not ghosts. Metal shifting inside hidden spaces. Loose mechanisms beneath old wood. Secrets refusing to stay buried quietly. A distant engine sound drifted faintly across the bayou again. Closer this time. Savannah extinguished the lantern immediately. The cabin dropped into dim gray daylight. She moved silently toward the window and lowered herself carefully beneath it. Somewhere beyond the trees, a boat motor slowed. Then idle. Her breathing became shallow. Nobody should have known she was here. For nearly a minute, the engine remained stationary somewhere out beyond the reeds. Savannah could not see the boat itself through the heavy vegetation, but she knew enough about bayou water to understand something important. Engines rarely stopped accidentally out there. People stopped because they were looking for something, or someone. Eventually, the motor started moving again, gradually fading deeper into the marsh channels until silence returned. Savannah remained crouched beside the window long after the sound disappeared. Then slowly, very carefully, she turned her head back toward the hidden compartment beneath the floor. She still did not know what rested inside it. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty now. Whatever had been sealed beneath the Maribel all those years ago still mattered enough that somebody out in the bayou had not stopped watching for it. Savannah did not open the compartment that day. Fear wanted her to. Fear always demanded quick answers, so it could decide whether to run. But fear and survival were not the same thing. So instead of forcing the lock immediately, she spent the rest of the afternoon preparing carefully. She checked every door latch on the Maribel, moved the lantern away from visible windows, covered part of the cabin glass with old cloth to block light after dark. Then she searched the boat for anything that might fit the tiny keyhole beneath the floor. Nothing. By evening, frustration sat heavy beneath her ribs. The compartment existed. She had touched it, heard it, seen the scratches surrounding it. Yet the secret remained sealed only inches beneath her feet. Rain moved through the bayou after sunset, in thin drifting sheets that rattled softly against the roof. Savannah sat beside the stove, turning the brass compass slowly between her fingers while weak firelight shifted across the cabin walls. Her grandfather's words returned again. Things disappear out here. Roads. Boats. Sometimes people. At the time, she thought he meant storms. Now she wondered if he meant something else entirely. Near midnight, unable to sleep, Savannah rose and began checking the cabin again with the lantern. Not searching randomly this time. Looking for patterns. People hid things according to habit. Her grandfather once hid cash inside coffee tins because he trusted kitchens more than banks. Her mother tucked letters inside flour sacks because nobody searched ordinary places carefully. Secrets usually lived near routines. Savannah stopped beside the narrow table bolted to the wall. The initials carved beneath it still bothered her. Yay. Day. Below them rested the old river marker symbol. She crouched slowly and ran her fingers beneath the underside again. This time she felt something different. A groove. Very thin. Carefully hidden near the back edge. Savannah angled the lantern lower. A small piece of wood had been fitted into the underside of the table almost perfectly flush with the surface. Her pulse quickened. Using the screwdriver tip, she pried gently against the edge. The hidden panel snapped loose. Something small slid onto the floorboards. Okay. Old brass. No larger than her thumb. Savannah stared at it for several seconds without moving. Then she looked slowly toward the compartment beneath the floor. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across distant marshland. The cabin suddenly felt impossibly quiet. She crossed the room carefully, knelt beside the loosened boards, and inserted the key into the tiny rusted lock. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, the mechanism clicked. Soft. Ancien. Real. Savannah pulled the steel handle upward. The compartment resisted hard at first before finally lifting open with a grinding metallic groan that echoed through the cabin loud enough to make her flinch. Cold air rose from below, carrying the smell of damp paper, rust, river water, and something older she could not immediately name. The hidden space beneath the floor was deeper than expected. Not a simple storage hatch. A concealed chamber built directly into the lower structure of the boat. Savannah lowered the lantern carefully. Inside rested 3 metal lockboxes, wrapped in oilcloth, several thick bundles of papers tied with cord, and a wooden case darkened by age and moisture. She stared downward in disbelief. Not money, not jewels, documents, boxes, records, the kind of things people hid because they feared discovery more than theft. Hands trembling now, Savannah lifted the first bundle carefully onto the floor beside her. The top page contained a parish land map. Dozens of sections had been marked in faded red ink. Names filled the margins beside different properties. Some had X marks beside them, others carried handwritten dates. Savannah frowned. Then she saw the pattern. Many names repeated beside different parcels over multiple decades. Families losing land, one after another. She untied another bundle. Letters, bank forms, property transfers, insurance records. Several pages carried official parish stamps. Others appeared copied secretly by hand. And nearly all of them connected the same group of influential families who still controlled much of the region surrounding the bayou. The deeper Savannah searched, the worse the truth became. Land seizures disguised as unpaid debt, false flood damage claims, families pressured into selling for almost nothing after suspicious accidents. Disappearances. One report described a fisherman vanishing after refusing to surrender marsh rights connected to shrimp routes. Another involved a widow whose property transferred ownership only 3 weeks after her husband drowned. Savannah's stomach tightened painfully. This was not random corruption. It was organized, generational, systematic. The Maribel had been carrying evidence of it for decades. Then Savannah opened the wooden case. Inside rested photographs, dozens of them, families standing beside homes no longer existing. Fishing crews posing near docks long reclaimed by swamp water, children beside gardens, church gatherings, funerals. Some photos had names written carefully along the back edges. Others contained dates only. And beneath the stack rested one final photograph that stopped Savannah's breathing entirely. Her grandfather, younger by many years, standing beside another man near the Maribel itself. Both looked serious, afraid, almost. On the back, written in faded blue ink, were 6 words. If anything happens, keep copies hidden. Savannah lowered herself slowly onto the floor. The lantern shook in her grip. Her grandfather knew. Not only knew, participated. Another folded document slipped partly loose beneath the photograph. Savannah unfolded it carefully. A handwritten journal page. The writing belonged to someone named Julien Delacroix. The 14th of July 1983. They took the Guidryland today after forcing the family onto debt papers they could not read. Celia cried so hard she became sick beside the dock. Thomas says we keep collecting names until enough people can prove the pattern publicly. Sheriff already suspects something. If this reaches the wrong hands before copies spread, none of us are safe. Savannah read the passage twice. Thomas, her grandfather's name. She searched the chamber frantically after that, pulling more records into the lantern light. More journals, more ledgers, more evidence. Each piece connected another part of the same hidden machine controlling the parish for generations. And buried among the documents rested something even more dangerous. A federal correspondence file, unopened, addressed to a regional investigative office in Baton Rouge. Never delivered. Savannah stared at the envelope. Someone had tried exposing everything before. Someone failed. Outside, rain intensified against the roof. The bayou wind pushed hard enough against the boat to rock the cabin slightly. Savannah suddenly understood why people feared the Maribel, not because of ghosts, because the boat carried proof powerful enough to destroy respected names, businesses, and entire family legacies. The realization settled coldly into her chest. If others learned she found these records, they would not see her as a homeless 19-year-old girl anymore. They would see her as a threat, and threats disappeared in the bayou all the time. Savannah forced herself to breathe slowly. Think, not panic. She organized the papers into separate stacks across the floor. Land records, insurance files, witness statements, photographs, journal page. The evidence formed a timeline stretching nearly 40 years. 40 years of stolen property, intimidation, disappearances, and carefully buried truth. Yet hidden among the horror sat something else too. Responsibility. These documents did not simply expose crimes. They carried the names of victims, families, people erased quietly because powerful men believed nobody important would notice. Savannah looked again at the photograph of her grandfather. For the first time since his death years earlier, she understood the sadness he always carried back from the water. He had known what lived beneath the surface of the parish, and somehow, despite fear, he tried helping preserve the truth. The houseboat creaked softly beneath another gust of wind. Savannah closed her eyes briefly. Then she made a decision. She would not sell the documents, would not burn them, would not hand them quietly back to the people who buried them. Whatever happened next, the Maribel had carried these voices through decades of silence. Now they belonged to someone willing to listen. And somewhere out beyond the dark Louisiana marshes, powerful people still believed their secrets were safely drowned beneath the bayou forever. Savannah barely slept after opening the compartment. Every sound around the Maribel carried new meaning now. Water against the hull, branches brushing the roof, engines somewhere beyond the reeds. Before the discovery, the bayou felt lonely. Afterward, it felt watched. Just before sunrise, she repacked the documents carefully into separate bundles and wrapped them again in oilcloth. But she did not return everything to the hidden chamber. Instinct warned her against trusting a single hiding place, so she divided the evidence. Some records returned beneath the floor. Others she concealed inside the old stove compartment beneath loose ash and rusted grates. The federal correspondence file she wrapped inside plastic and tied beneath the rear deck using fishing line. Her grandfather used to say survival depended on never losing everything at once. By mid-morning, clouds burned away beneath brutal Louisiana heat. Humidity rose from the water thick enough to blur distance. Savannah worked quietly repairing part of the outer railing while trying to appear ordinary, as though she were simply another desperate girl fixing a ruined boat. But fear had already changed the rhythm of her movements. Every distant engine made her pause. Every bird scattering from the reeds tightened something inside her chest. Near noon, a boat finally approached the dock. Savannah saw it through the window first. Long aluminum hull, dark green paint, parish registration numbers along the side. Sheriff's Department. Her hands froze around the screwdriver. The boat motor idled low as it drifted toward the Maribel. Then Sheriff Dalton Price stepped onto the dock. He was taller than Savannah expected, broad across the shoulders, with silver beginning to spread through dark hair near his temples. His uniform looked pressed despite the heat. Sunglasses hid his eyes, but the stillness in his posture unsettled her immediately. This was a man used to walking into places already believing he controlled them. Savannah opened the cabin door slowly before he could knock. "Morning," he said politely. The politeness felt rehearsed. Savannah nodded carefully. "Can I help you?" Sheriff Price removed his sunglasses. His eyes studied everything: the repaired railing, the cleaned cabin windows, the tools beside her feet. "You're Pastor Reed's daughter." "Not a question." "Yes. Heard you moved out here." Didn't realize that was illegal. One corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. "No, just unusual." His gaze drifted toward the cabin interior. "Most people don't last long on the Maribel." Savannah forced herself to stay calm. "It floats." "That it does." The sheriff stepped farther onto the dock without asking permission. "You planning to stay a while?" "I don't know yet." He nodded slowly, as though considering something beyond the conversation itself. Then his eyes settled briefly on the floorboards near the loosened compartment. Only for a second, but Savannah noticed, and she knew he noticed her noticing. A dangerous silence settled between them. Finally, Sheriff Price spoke again. "Boats got history around here." He slipped the sunglasses back on. "Some stories are better left buried." Savannah felt heat rise along the back of her neck. "I'm not interested in stories." "No?" His tone remained calm. "Then what exactly are you interested in?" For one reckless moment, Savannah considered lying poorly. Instead, she answered carefully. "A place to live." The sheriff studied her several seconds longer. Then, he nodded once and stepped backward toward the dock. "Well, you keep yourself safe out here." He paused. "Bayou's full of unstable people." This time the warning was obvious. After he left, Savannah stood motionless inside the doorway until the patrol boat disappeared beyond the trees. Only then did her knees begin shaking. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. That evening, Savannah moved the most important records again. This time, into the marsh itself. Near sunset, she used the small skiff tied behind the Maribel to paddle through narrow channels hidden by reeds until she found an old cypress stump rising from shallow water. Beneath tangled roots, she sealed several document bundles inside waterproof wrapping and buried them beneath mud. The mosquitoes nearly drove her insane while working. Still, she kept going, because fear now came with shape and direction. The sheriff was not curious. He was checking whether the compartment had already been discovered. Darkness settled quickly across the bayou by the time Savannah returned to the houseboat, and someone had been there. She knew immediately. The cabin door remained locked, but one of the windows hung slightly wider than before. A muddy footprint marked the outer deck near the railing. Savannah's pulse slammed hard against her ribs. Slowly she stepped inside. The lantern remained where she left it. The stove door hung open. One chair had been moved slightly sideways. Tiny details. Searching details. She grabbed the wrench from the toolbox instinctively and crossed toward the hidden compartment. The floorboards were closed, but one bolt sat crooked. Someone opened it. Or tried to. Savannah backed away slowly. Her breathing became shallow again. They came while she was gone. The realization spread coldly through her body. Not random thieves. Not vandals. Someone specifically searching the Maribel. A loud engine roared suddenly somewhere beyond the reeds. Then laughter. Young men. Drunk. Moments later, something struck the side of the houseboat hard enough to shake the cabin. Bang. Glass shattered near the rear wall. Savannah flinched backward. Another object slammed against the hull. Beer bottle. Voices echoed from outside. "Boat ought to sink already." More laughter followed. Then another crash. Savannah extinguished the lantern instantly and crouched low beside the table, gripping the wrench with both hands. Her heart pounded so violently she thought they might hear it. Outside, the boat circled slowly through the dark water. "You hear that ghost girl screaming yet?" One voice shouted mockingly. The others laughed again. But beneath the drunken cruelty, Savannah sensed something worse. Testing. Pressure. Intimidation disguised as stupidity. The circling boat finally drifted away after several more minutes, engine noise fading gradually into the swamp darkness. Savannah remained crouched long afterward. The cabin smelled sharply now from spilled beer and broken glass mixed with swamp humidity. Her hands shook uncontrollably around the wrench, not because she thought the young men would return tonight, because she understood what came next. The pressure would continue increasing. Warnings. Fear. Offers. Threats. People who buried crimes for 40 years would not suddenly become merciful because a 19-year-old girl stumbled into the truth. The following morning proved her right. A truck waited near the marina when Savannah returned briefly for supplies. Two men stood beside it wearing expensive boots too clean for real bayou work. One introduced himself as Charles Beaumont. Savannah recognized the surname immediately from the land records. Beaumont properties appeared everywhere in the files. "We heard you bought the Maribel," the man said pleasantly. Savannah kept both hands inside her coat pockets. "Yes, that old thing's dangerous," he smiled carefully. "Liability issue, honestly." She said nothing. Beaumont continued smoothly. "I'd be willing to solve the problem for you." He removed an envelope from his jacket. $5,000. Savannah stared at him. 5,000. More money than she had ever held in her life. Enough for an apartment, a car, food, safety, normalce. All she had to do was surrender the boat, the hidden compartment, the evidence, the dead voices waiting beneath the floorboards. Beaumont extended the envelope slightly closer. "You're young," he said softly. "No reason to tie yourself to old problems." Savannah looked at the money for several long seconds, then slowly shook her head. "No." His smile faded just slightly. "You sure?" Savannah met his eyes fully for the first time. "No," she repeated quietly. "This stays where they tried to bury it." For the first time since arriving in the bayou, real fear crossed the man's face. Not fear of her. Fear of what she might already know. After refusing Beaumont's offer, Savannah stopped believing she could survive alone. Until then, isolation had felt safer. Silence kept attention away. Silence kept her alive. But once powerful people realized she would not surrender the Maribel quietly, silence became dangerous in a different way. If something happened to her now, the truth could disappear again with almost no resistance. So for the first time since arriving in the bayou, Savannah began letting other people see pieces of what she carried. Carefully, one person at a time. The first was Jonah Batiste. She met him properly 3 days after Beaumont's visit when the Maribel's engine failed near a shallow marsh channel several miles from the dock. Savannah spent nearly an hour leaning into the engine compartment under brutal afternoon heat, while mosquitoes swarmed around her face and neck. Fuel line problem, she knew that much. But one of the lower connections had rusted nearly solid. By the time another boat drifted into view, grease covered both her hands and frustration burned hot behind her eyes. Jonah cut his engine several yards away and studied the Maribel silently. He looked around 30, lean and dark-haired, with sun-weathered skin and the calm posture of someone who spent most of life outdoors. A faded tattoo disappeared beneath one sleeve near his wrist. "You flooded the secondary line," he said finally. Savannah straightened carefully. "You can tell from there? Smell." He tied his small workboat alongside the Maribel and climbed aboard without unnecessary conversation. Within minutes he loosened the clogged fitting using one of his own tools, and bled the line properly while Savannah watched. The engine started immediately afterward. "You worked marine repair?" she asked. "Shrimp boats mostly." Savannah hesitated before speaking again. "Why help me?" Jonah wiped grease from his hands with a rag. "Because people around here usually only bother threatening girls when those girls found something valuable." The words landed heavily between them. Savannah studied him carefully. "You know about the boat." "Everybody knows about the boat." He shrugged lightly. "Question is whether they know why they're afraid of it." For a moment neither spoke. Then Jonah glanced toward the cabin floor behind her. "You open it yet?" Savannah's body went completely still. He noticed immediately. "That means yes." Fear tightened through her chest again. Jonah raised one hand calmly. "If I wanted to hurt you, I wouldn't be fixing engines first." Savannah remained silent. After several long seconds, Jonah sighed and leaned against the railing. "My grandfather worked the marsh routes with Julien Delacroix," he said quietly. "People around here pretend they don't remember those names anymore, but old families do." His eyes drifted toward the black water. "My grandmother used to say good people disappeared around this parish long before hurricanes started taking the blame." Savannah stared at him carefully. "You believe the records are real. I know they are." The certainty in his voice frightened her almost as much as the discovery itself. That evening, Jonah followed the Maribel back toward the hidden dock to help reinforce part of the damaged mooring posts before another storm arrived. He worked quietly beside Savannah while sunset burned orange through the swamp trees. Not once did he ask to see the documents. That mattered. Trust in the bayou came slowly, usually through work before words. Over the next several weeks, the circle around Savannah widened carefully. An elderly woman named Celia Guidry arrived first. Savannah recognized the surname immediately from the hidden records. Celia stepped onto the dock carrying peach preserves in glass jars and stared at the Maribel for a long time before speaking. "My daddy used to say that boat remembered things," she whispered. Inside the cabin, Savannah finally showed someone outside Jonah a portion of the documents. Celia cried halfway through reading them, not loudly. The quiet kind of crying old people sometimes do after carrying grief too long. "They told us my brother drowned drunk," she said, wiping her face slowly. "But he'd been fighting those land transfers for months." She pointed trembling fingers toward one photograph. That's him. Savannah felt something shift inside her then. Until that moment, the evidence felt historical. Terrible but distant. Now the victims had living faces. Living families. Word spread carefully after Celia's visit. Not publicly. Quietly. An old fisherman came next, carrying parish maps hidden in plastic wrapping beneath his truck seat. Then a retired clerk from the records office arrived after dark with copied tax filings she claimed disappeared years earlier. A young local reporter named Daniel Mercer visited twice pretending to interview shrimpers nearby before finally admitting he had spent years trying to connect suspicious property transfers across the parish. The problem, Daniel explained while sitting beside the stove one humid evening, is nobody survives long enough politically to prove the whole pattern. He glanced toward the hidden floor compartment. Looks like somebody finally did. The Maribel slowly transformed after that. Not into something comfortable, but into something alive. Lanterns glowed more often after sunset now. Voices occasionally drifted through the cabin beside the stove. Coffee simmered while maps and records spread across the old table beneath weak yellow light. For the first time in years, people connected to the buried crimes began speaking openly to one another. Carefully, fearfully, but openly. And through all of it, Savannah noticed something unexpected happening inside herself too. She stopped lowering her eyes constantly, stopped apologizing before speaking, stopped feeling like an intruder inside every room she entered. The bayou still frightened her. The sheriff still watched. Boats still moved through distant channels at night. But now, when Savannah looked around the cabin of the Maribel, she no longer saw only a hiding place for secrets. She saw proof that silence had begun breaking apart. One humid evening near the end of summer, Jonas stood beside her on the outer deck while fog drifted slowly across the black water. "You realize they're gonna come harder eventually," he said quietly. Savannah nodded. "I know. You still staying?" She looked back toward the cabin where lantern light glowed softly through cracked windows onto stacks of records spread across the table. Then she looked out across the dark bayou surrounding them. Weeks earlier, the isolation felt like punishment. Now it felt almost sacred, a forgotten place, carrying forgotten voices. And somehow, against every expectation, the Maribel had stopped being the place where Savannah disappeared. It had become the place where people finally started finding her. The federal investigators arrived on a Wednesday morning under gray skies thick with incoming rain. By then, Sheriff Dalton Price already knew the walls around him were beginning to crack. Too many people had started talking. Too many old records had resurfaced. And most dangerous of all, too many frightened families had begun realizing they were not isolated tragedies. After all, they were evidence of a system. Savannah watched the first unmarked vehicles roll into the parish courthouse parking lot from across the street beside Daniel Mercer. Rainwater gathered along the curb near their boots while reporters unloaded cameras beneath umbrellas. "You ready for this?" Daniel asked quietly. Savannah looked toward the courthouse entrance. No, not remotely. Her stomach felt tight enough to make breathing uncomfortable. Sleep had become nearly impossible over the last week. Strange trucks slowed near the marina at night. 2 windows on the Maribel had been smashed. Someone killed the dock generator 3 evenings earlier. Pressure from the parish had intensified exactly the way Jonah predicted. But so had support. Behind Savannah now stood families carrying decades of buried grief. Fishermen, clerks, widows, retired workers, people who spent most of their lives believing nobody important would ever care what happened to them. Now, federal investigators were finally asking questions, and powerful men had begun panicking. "That her?" one reporter whispered nearby. Savannah lowered her eyes automatically before catching herself. No, not anymore. She straightened slightly and walked toward the courthouse entrance carrying the weathered document case beneath her arm. The same case pulled from beneath the floorboards of the Maribel. The same case powerful families tried buying, stealing, and frightening away. Inside the courtroom chamber, the air smelled faintly of dust, wet coats, and old wood polish. Ceiling fans turned lazily overhead while local officials filled the front rows with carefully controlled expressions. Sheriff Price sat beside Charles Beaumont near the left side of the room. Both men looked calm, too calm, the kind of calm people practiced before cameras arrived. Savannah recognized several surnames from the hidden records seated throughout the chamber. Landowners, business operators, council members. Men whose families appeared repeatedly across 4 decades of property seizures and suspicious deaths. Some stared openly at her. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Jonah sat several rows behind Savannah near Celia Guidry, and 2 elderly fishermen prepared to testify. Daniel organized papers beside the back wall, while federal investigators quietly spoke among themselves. Then Sheriff Price smiled. Not warmly, confidently. And Savannah suddenly understood something important. He still believed she could be discredited. The hearing began slowly. Investigators presented property records first, then insurance inconsistencies, then testimony from families pressured into impossible debt agreements before losing land under suspicious circumstances. Patterns emerged quickly, too quickly for local officials to dismiss entirely. Still, Beaumont's attorneys fought every step. Coincidence, unverified claims, emotional interpretation, poor record preservation. Again and again they attacked credibility instead of evidence. Then Savannah's name was called. Every sound inside the chamber seemed to disappear as she stood. For one brief, terrible moment, 19-year-old Savannah Reed returned completely, the frightened girl standing alone outside church doors while entire rooms judged her before she spoke. Her hands trembled slightly around the document case. Jonah noticed. Without speaking, he gave one small nod. Steady. Savannah walked forward. The courtroom lights felt painfully bright after months spent mostly beneath lantern glow and swamp darkness. She sat carefully at the witness table while microphones adjusted nearby. One attorney rose immediately. A tall man with silver hair and a smooth, practiced voice. "Miss Reed," he began pleasantly, "you are currently unemployed, correct?" Savannah kept her voice even. "Yes. And prior to discovering these documents, you were living alone aboard an abandoned vessel in difficult conditions?" "Yes." "You have no legal training?" "No." "No investigative background?" "No." The attorney smiled faintly toward the room as though building something obvious. "So what exactly qualifies you to interpret complex land and financial records spanning 40 years? There it was. Not evidence. Her worth. Savannah felt the old instinct to shrink inward rise immediately, but another memory rose with it. Her grandfather's voice over Blackwater. Most people panic before they think, so she thought. Then answered calmly, "I'm not interpreting them, I'm reading them." The room shifted slightly. The attorney's smile tightened. "You expect this court to believe you uncovered a conspiracy local officials somehow missed for decades?" "No," Savannah replied quietly. "I expect the court to read what they ignored." Several reporters glanced upward immediately. The attorney changed direction. "You were removed from your father's home shortly before this discovery, correct?" Savannah recognized the move instantly now. Humiliation. Discredit the girl before confronting the evidence. "Yes." "And you've experienced emotional distress since then?" "Yes." "So, is it possible your personal circumstances affected your judgment regarding ordinary parish records?" Savannah opened the document case slowly. Inside rested copies of the ledgers, photographs, transfer forms, and federal correspondence file. She removed one page carefully. "Is this my emotional distress?" she asked. The attorney said nothing. Savannah placed another document beside it. "And this?" "Another. And this?" Her voice never rose. That frightened the room more. These families lost land after falsified flood claims. She slid another paper forward. These insurance filings were approved by the same office connected to Sheriff Price's relatives. Another page. These signatures belonged to dead men transferring property weeks after burial. The attorney attempted interruption. Savannah continued anyway. "Calm. Precisi." Months earlier, she would have apologized instinctively for speaking too long. Now she simply told the truth. "You can question where I lived," she said softly. "You can question my education. You can question whether a 19-year-old girl should have found these records before trained officials did." Her eyes lifted toward Sheriff Price. "But you cannot change what the papers say." Absolute silence followed. Then movement near the back row. Celia Guidry slowly stood. The elderly woman's hands shook visibly as she faced the courtroom. "My brother didn't drown drunk," she said. "And everybody in this parish knew it." One by one, others followed. An old fisherman described threats after refusing marsh transfers. A retired clerk admitted records disappeared from storage years earlier. Another widow identified signatures forged after her husband's death. The room gradually transformed. Not into spectacle. Into recognition. People realizing decades of private grief connected together publicly for the first time. Sheriff Price finally stood near the end of the hearing. His calm mask had begun cracking now. "This entire process is built on stolen materials and emotional storytelling," he said sharply. "That girl has manipulated frightened people with rumors dug from abandoned trash." Savannah turned slowly toward him. The fear inside her still existed, but it no longer controlled her voice. "No," she said quietly. "You taught this parish to bury things where poor people live so nobody important would look." The sheriff stared at her coldly. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Savannah removed one final item from the case. The photograph of her grandfather beside Julien Delacroix. Then the undelivered federal correspondence file. "I think you knew exactly what was hidden beneath the Maribel," she said. For the first time since entering the courtroom, genuine panic crossed Sheriff Price's face. One federal investigator immediately stepped forward requesting the envelope. The courtroom erupted after that. Attorneys speaking over one another. Reporters rushing toward exits. Investigators gathering documents rapidly. Sheriff Price attempting to leave before federal agents intercepted him near the side aisle. And through all the noise, Savannah remained seated, breathing carefully, watching decades of silence finally collapse under its own weight. Outside, rain began hammering the courthouse windows hard enough to blur the town beyond the glass. A Louisiana storm, heavy, relentless, the kind that washed hidden things out from underneath the mud. And as federal agents escorted Sheriff Dalton Price through the courtroom doors while cameras exploded in flashes around him, Savannah realized something extraordinary. Nobody in the room looked at her like a discarded girl anymore. They looked at her like the person who opened the compartment nobody else had the courage to touch. The arrest began before sunrise 2 days later. By then, national reporters had already reached the parish. Satellite trucks lined streets that once sat empty after dark. Camera crews filmed outside the courthouse while federal investigators moved in and out carrying sealed evidence boxes beneath gray Louisiana skies. Sheriff Dalton Price resigned publicly that morning before being taken into custody shortly afterward. Charles Beaumont followed before noon. 3 additional officials connected to parish property transfers were suspended pending investigation, and federal auditors began reopening land records stretching back nearly 4 decades. The bayou had finally stopped swallowing the truth quietly. Savannah watched most of it from the dock beside the Maribel. She did not attend the arrests, did not stand near courthouse cameras, did not give dramatic interviews. After months of pressure, threats, fear, and sleepless nights, she discovered something unexpected about victory. It felt quieter than anger. The morning after Sheriff Price's arrest, Celia Guidry arrived carrying coffee and sat beside Savannah on the dock while fog drifted low across the water. "My brother would have liked you," the elderly woman said softly. Savannah stared toward the reeds. "I didn't do this alone." "No," Celia agreed. "But you're the one who stayed." That sentence settled deeply inside her, because staying had been the hardest part. Not the discovery, not the hearing, not even the fear. Staying long enough to listen when everyone else wanted the Maribel abandoned again. Over the following weeks, the parish changed slowly. Not magically, not perfectly, but visibly. Families once too frightened to speak publicly began filing claims to recover stolen marsh property. State investigators reopened multiple disappearance cases connected to the old records. Reporters uncovered additional corruption stretching beyond the bayou into regional business networks. And somewhere beneath all the legal chaos, ordinary people began returning to the water differently. Conversations that once stopped in public now continued openly. Old fishermen gathered near marina benches discussing names they had avoided saying for years. Widows brought photographs to investigators. Clerks quietly delivered missing files from storage rooms nobody trusted before. The silence had broken. One afternoon near the end of summer, a federal representative arrived at the dock carrying official paperwork. Savannah expected another interview. Instead, the woman handed her a folder. "What's this?" "The Maribel's ownership transfer." The representative glanced toward the houseboat. "Turns out the vessel was never processed correctly after the Delacroix disappearance." She offered a small smile. "Legally speaking, she belongs to you now." Savannah stared at the papers without speaking. "Belongs to you." Nobody had ever handed her those words before. Not about a home. Not about land. Not about anything lasting. Her throat tightened painfully. The federal representative noticed. "You all right?" Savannah nodded once, though it took effort. Yes. That evening she sat alone inside the cabin, while rain tapped softly against repaired sections of the roof. The Maribel still smelled faintly of old wood, rust, and river water, but the space no longer felt abandoned. Tools hung neatly beside the stove now. Fresh curtains covered the cracked windows. The floorboards had been reinforced. And most importantly, the hidden compartment remained empty. Not because the truth disappeared again, because the truth no longer needed hiding. Savannah opened the brass compass in her hands slowly. The cracked glass still reflected lantern light the same way it had beside her grandfather's boat years earlier. For a long moment she imagined what he might say if he could see the Maribel now. Not restored completely. Not beautiful. But alive again. Much like the people connected to it. Outside, another boat approached the dock. Jonah stepped onto the planks carrying a paper bag filled with supplies. "You eating anything besides canned beans yet?" he asked. Savannah smiled faintly. "Sometimes. That's concerning." He handed her the bag before leaning against the railing beside the cabin door. Warm evening wind moved through the cypress trees while insects hummed softly across the water. "You know," Jonah said after a while, Most folks expected you to sell this place once everything ended. Savannah looked toward the dark water surrounding the Maribel. The hidden channels. The fog. The dock where she first arrived with nothing except fear and $5 less than hope. No, she said quietly. I think this place spent too long belonging to people who wanted silence. Jonah studied her for a second, then nodded once. The lantern light behind them reflected gently across the bayou, while the old houseboat drifted against its moorings with slow, steady movement. Not sinking. Still floating. Still here. Just like the girl nobody expected to survive inside it. Autumn arrived slowly in the bayou. Not with dramatic color the way northern states changed, but through subtler things, cooler mornings drifting across the water, fewer insects screaming after sunset, thinner humidity settling over the marsh channels before dawn. By October, the Maribel no longer looked like a dying boat abandoned to swamp rot. She looked lived in. The rust remained in places. Some windows still carried cracks too expensive to replace immediately. One section of the outer railing leaned slightly crooked no matter how many times Jonah tried fixing it. But warm lantern light now glowed through the cabin most evenings. Smoke rose from the stovepipe during cold mornings, and flowers grew inside old fishing tins along the outer deck where Savannah placed them beside the windows. The hidden compartment beneath the floor stayed empty, except for one thing. The photograph of her grandfather standing beside Julian Delacroix. Savannah kept it there intentionally. Not hidden. Protected. The rest of the evidence now lived inside official archives, court records, and investigative offices spread far beyond the parish. More arrests followed throughout the fall. Several stolen land transfers were reversed. Families began recovering property long believed lost forever. None of it repaired the past completely, but for the first time in decades, powerful men in the parish understood something important. Poor people remembered things too. One cool evening near sunset, Savannah walked slowly down the dock carrying a box of repaired journals gathered from the Maribel. Daniel Mercer planned to archive copies through a regional historical project documenting the bayou communities erased through corruption. The idea still felt strange to Savannah sometimes. That voices buried beneath swamp silence for generations would now survive in libraries, newspapers, and records impossible to sink quietly into marsh water again. Celia Gridry waited near the dock bench wrapped in a faded blue sweater. "You're late," the older woman complained gently. Savannah smiled. The stovepipe collapsed again. Boat stubborn. Suong wai. Celia laughed softly at that. Together they sat watching evening fog drift low across the water while distant birds crossed above the reeds. After a while, Celia spoke again. "You know folks talk about you differently now." Savannah looked down at the journals resting in her lap. "How?" "They don't say Pastor Reed's daughter anymore." Celia glanced toward her carefully. "They say your name first." The words hit harder than Savannah expected, because for most of her life, she belonged to other people's definitions. The preacher's daughter, the unwanted girl, the homeless one, the shameful one. Even after finding the records beneath the Maribel, part of her still expected the world to eventually push her back into silence again. But now, when people came to the dock, they came looking for Savannah Reed. Not someone's mistake, not someone's burden. Here. Later that night, after Celia left and the bayou settled into darkness, Savannah remained alone on the outer deck beneath a blanket watching fog move across the water. The air smelled faintly of river mud, wood smoke, and distant rain. Somewhere far beyond the reeds, another boat engine echoed softly through the channels before fading into silence. Months earlier, that sound would have terrified her. Now it simply sounded like life continuing. She opened the brass compass again. The needle still pointed steadily north despite cracked glass and worn metal. Her grandfather once told her old tools survived because people cared enough to keep repairing them. At the time, she thought he only meant boats. Savannah leaned back against the railing and looked toward the cabin windows glowing behind her. The Maribel had changed, not into luxury, not into wealth, into shelter, into memory, into proof that broken places could still hold dignity if someone stayed long enough to listen carefully. A soft knock sounded against the dock post below. Jonah's skiff drifted beside the mooring line. "You asleep up there?" he called quietly. "Not yet." He lifted a paper bag slightly. "Brought pie." Savannah laughed under her breath. "At this hour? Celia says you forget meals when you're writing." Savannah glanced toward the journal resting beside her chair. The first pages were finally filled now, not with escape plans, not with boat sketches, with names, stories, truths. She climbed carefully down toward the dock while Jonah tied off the skiff beneath lantern light. The bayou water moved slowly around them, black and calm beneath the fog. For a moment, Savannah stopped and looked back toward the Maribel. The old houseboat floated quietly beside the dock, lantern light glowing warm through repaired windows while swamp mist curled gently around the hull. Months ago, everyone called it worthless, dangerous, cursed, a place people disappeared inside. But the Maribel had done the opposite. It had returned names people tried to erase. It had carried truth longer than fear could bury it. And somehow, in saving the voices hidden beneath its floorboards, the old houseboat had rescued something else too. A 19-year-old girl once abandoned beside a church road with a suitcase and nowhere left to belong. The world had called her disposable. The world had called the Maribel worthless. But beneath rust, silence, grief, and swamp water, both had been waiting for the same thing all along. Someone willing to stay,